Here for some talk about what it was like on the home front. You guys didn't experience that, but maybe wives did, or you heard what went on during that time. And then after that, we're going to get into a session where we're going to try to cover a little bit of what it was like to be a replacement, which many of you were during that time. So you'll perhaps have a time to give some feedback on what it was like personally for that. Also going to talk with one man, John Colton, who was commissioned, got a battlefield commission during the service. You'd like to know what that was like, going from a sergeant to a lieutenant. Turns out in this case it was, well, you'll learn. It's a very, very nice transition. Also talk a little bit about perhaps what it was like, well, not what it was like, but the experience that the prisoners of war encountered. And you may have talked in other reunions to some there that can maybe even give some additional feedback to what I'll give you. So that's kind of the plan for the afternoon. As a way of introduction here for Tom, let me read something shortly right here. This is part of an account that Jack Moran wrote about his experience, and this is something that happened in the early phase of the SAR, in some of the first days of combat in the 347. At a signal, we climbed out of our foxholes, lined up in a spread formation, and started to advance over an open field. We could have just as easily gone down along the hedgerows and avoided some exposure, and I mentioned that, but we were told that orders were orders, so we started out. We hadn't gone 50 feet when the first 88 barrage hit. Their spotter could obviously see us coming. It was our first exposure to enemy fire, and it was really something. One of the first shells landed about 100 feet to my right, and I immediately heard several screams. I looked over and saw that Shady, Phillips, and Valesco were all down and wounded or dead. Tommy Langston, my squad leader, was lying in the mud about 20 feet in front of me, and he looked back and gave me a big grin. I grinned back, but I'm sure those grins were coming to cover up our true feelings at the moment. Tommy threw me a K-ration, which was going to be my breakfast when I would get time to eat it, and shortly we got up and advanced about 200 yards or more as more 88s began falling. The Tommy Langston he refers to is this young man's uncle, and for which he is named. He was later on, that very day, I think, was killed in combat. But Tom read about, I think, this account online some years ago, made contact with Jack Moran, who was with his uncle at the time, and Jack was at a reunion last year. Some of you probably got a chance to meet him there. Last year, Tom was just unbelievable as a host here in Pittsburgh, arranging the flight that many of you were able to take, and just did so many great things. And he's agreed to talk a little bit about, even though he didn't experience what it was like, and get some feedback from you during the peacetime here in the U.S. I present Tom Langston.
Thank you. I'm going to move it over here. I will tell you quickly, for those of you that have the opportunity, can you hear me without it, or do I need to use the microphone? Jack Moran and I went back to Germany, Belgium, and France this year for Memorial Day, and I would suggest anyone that has the opportunity to take a veteran back, that you make that a priority, because it's a special, special time for the veteran as well as a family member. So Jack sends his regards and his wishes he was here. And thanks for the introduction. So when Karen asked me about the home front, we fell back on a comment, or there was a quote from President Roosevelt, and the quote was, "One front, one battle, where everyone in the United States, every man, woman, and child, is in action. That front is right here at home in our daily lives." So the perspective we'll take is looking at the things that happen here to support the war effort. So I'd like to have both women and men, and if you were children at the time, your thoughts and feedback of things that happened while most of the men were overseas. So Karen's going to help me with the passing of the microphone, and we'll try and get around to get as much feedback as possible. So starting out with starting out with something that's meaningful in my life was September 11th. It's a date that I'll remember for the rest of my life. So in a parallel, I thought the first question that would be interesting is to ask someone of their recollection where they were and what they were doing on December 7th, 1941. Anyone like to share how they heard about Pearl Harbor? Who told them? What was your feeling? If you can announce your name, that'd be great.
I'm Howard Moore. At that time, I was in NYA, a National Youth Administration camp, because we didn't have any work, and it was an opportunity to learn and to get by. So we heard it it's early in the morning. At this camp, there's probably 100 to 150 youth. And it was something we just could not believe, because we had no indication or anything like that. And there's a lot of talk as to what this would develop into. Being about 17 years old, well, we didn't have much to go on. But as it developed, by several of the people, they went ahead and enlisted, volunteered their services. So that's about it.
Thank you. How about a female perspective? Barbara? No? Can you share?
I know I was 11 years old on December 7th, 1941, and I was going to communion class on that afternoon, and they told us about it that afternoon. But more important to me was December 8th and December 9th, because that's when my father decided he would have to go overseas and rescue our country somehow or other. He was an architect, and so he went to Washington on December 9th, that was a Tuesday, and joined up. And so he was gone for my entire teenage years. Came back in 45.
That's awesome. Thank you. Anybody else? John? Or George?
John McAuliffe. I was a freshman at Holy Cross College in my hometown of Worcester, Massachusetts. My sister was a sophomore at Worcester State College in the same town. It was my freshman year, and they had the Naval ROTC the first year they started there. It's still continuing today, the longest Naval ROTC that still existed since World War II. But anyway, I couldn't get in that program because I was taking a BS in biology, and there wasn't enough time. But anyway, it was Sunday morning, and my sister was studying upstairs in her room. She had the radio going, playing music. And she come bursting into the living room saying, "We're at war, Pearl Harbor was attacked." And no one knew what Pearl Harbor was, so we all went scurrying to our geography maps, and we found out it was down in the South Pacific area. From then on, all the boys started being drafted. My class, it had 460 members in it, dwindled down to 26 civilians left. They were all within the Army or the Navy or whatever.
No, okay, George.
Well, I was shaving. I was in the bathroom. My dad came in and he said, "The Japs just bombed Pearl Harbor." I said, "Oh, that's terrible. When the hell is Pearl Harbor?" I was shaving, so I'm having a new date with my wife. She was the girlfriend at the time, and I thought I was so lucky to see me, and it's what happened on Pearl Harbor Day. Anybody else?
Another female perspective, maybe? Mrs. Purple?
I was almost 12.
So you girls should say I was a little girl.
I've been a girl.
Right? I was a little girl.
Okay. And it came over the radio. We were in the den. And all of a sudden, we stopped talking because it was a real announcement. I had 3 brothers, and they were of an age that they could go into service, and they did within the week. And I was very proud, but I was scared to death. Where is Pearl Harbor, and where are they going to be?
That's great, thank you. So we don't want to hear anything. We'll move on to the next question. One more.
Arnie's mother. I was 16 at the time, and I know a few days before Pearl Harbor, the Japanese diplomats were in Washington negotiating and everything else. Everybody had some thoughts on their mind. This was something very unusual going on. Of course, wars weren't mentioned and anything like that. But I probably, either December 5th or 6th, all these Japanese diplomats left the country. And of course, no one knew why, but it was a surprise. Why? They just abruptly left the country. And it was December 7th, I think I was bowling with my brother. It was about 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, or whatever the time difference was. And that's what we heard about the
Slogans. There were a lot of posters,
down there.
many of which themes are still recognized today. Some are considered marketing genius, and some were and are considered government propaganda. I have a book here, you're more than welcome to look through it later, and probably 70 or 80 different slogans that were tied to the effort. But so here's the question: was what slogans do you remember supporting the war effort at home?
What's slogans?
Slip on the left,
Scrap for the Japs.
slip on the left will sink a ship.
There you go. Loose lips sink ships. Right? This one was when you ride a
Don't
loving
forget to buy your bonds, your war bonds. That's what I remember.
There's a little section in here on war bonds too, so if you want to look at it, there's a lot of fun. A lot of different things. I think what you get Rosie the Riveter, right? That's still very, very well known.
We need you.
We need you. That's right.
I don't know.
Okay. Yeah. Good.
Uncle Sam wants you.
That's right. I was looking for I organized this, but I don't think the tabs are big enough to see where they are. So I know that one's in here. The recruiting. I want you for the U.S. Army. That's a very traditional classic one. So these will probably bring back a lot of memories. I encourage you to look through them. Some of them are risque, and some of them are funny, and some of them are more serious. So now the same thing with government propaganda. Does anyone have any memory of propaganda that may have been done through the government to support the government's position on the war effort?
When we were in the Army, we'd taken to see movies called Why We Fight. And they were produced in Hollywood by the Hollywood folk. And they were giving us all kinds of reasons, sensible ones, as to why we were fighting the war. They showed a lot of the stuff that was going on in Europe that was pretty awful. And some of the good stuff that was going on in the United States. We were supposed to get the idea that what was going on in Europe was terrible, and the stuff that was going on in the United States was more positive. But I remember the films, they were called Why We Fight. We would sit and watch those, and if they didn't come on right away, you started to stamp your feet and make a fuss, because they weren't supposed to keep us waiting, ever, but they did.
A positive remark on a soldier overseas. Does anyone recall seeing a small clip or anything particular about a movie or a show that provided a positive outlook on the war overseas?
I don't know what you're saying.
Okay. And then we talk about the posters. Obviously, Rosie the Riveter, any posters that anyone remembers being at home or at school, or any posters that you remember from signing up that would have been there.
I remember in school, there was a great sale of the war bond stamps. You put stamps in a book till you got up to enough to purchase a $25 bond, which was what, like 1875 or something.
So yeah, some of these, you see, they had stamp out war bonds, and they had all the different things that they try to convince you to think this is a picture of a wife taking the husband's wallet out, and he's saying, hey, wait a minute, make sure you give 10% to the war bond. So there's a lot of war bonds effort to collect to support the war.
And even before we got into the war, I remember very much the programs that were released in our part of Florida of Buckles for Britain, things to support the British.
Okay. Does anyone recall that one of the things that for people that didn't go overseas, the government had arranged for payroll deduction, so people could actually take it out of their pay, and that would go directly into to war bond. And a gentleman behind you, Karen, shaking his head, he recalls that. Maybe he can give us a straight ahead. Yeah.
Yes, I remember we take war bonds right out of the paycheck. The other thing I remember is food stamps, ration stamps, meat stamps. I still have the little thing that I think had little food stamp things.
Gasoline.
Coins in it. I still have it.
A, B, and C with gasoline.
I still recall having a ration stamp given to me at time of discharge to be able to buy a pair of civilian shoes.
All right. Let's stick on that topic for a second too, because I think the rationing was something that was very important. And the government had the first claim on food or raw materials during the war, and they were worried about shortage and set limits on certain things. So the question I had was we talked about what do you remember about the rationing, and so does anyone remember where they had to go and what they had to do to get the books?
They had a department, ration department.
Schools. So oftentimes there were schools.
City Hall.
City Hall. So
The response to that, when you came home on a leave, and you notice that when you have to go down and get some stamps, and I said, what are you talking about? Stamps. Well, we have to feed you. Or we have to get some meat for you. Well, I'm in the Army. What do I have to do? I was indignant.
right.
And then after that, later on, when we were in England, loose lips and so forth, how to avoid that. I met an old gentleman in England, and we talked about it, and he said, I'll write a letter to your dad. And he did. And of course, my father didn't know him, but he wrote it as if it familiar. And he said, oh, by the way, I was walking down the street and I bumped into his son, George. Me. My dad picked it up right away. He pinpointed me on the map where this had been mailed from in England. And he wrote me the letter. And he said, you're in Congleton. I said, how about that? You see how the thing in a circle.
That's neat. Okay. So some of the things they talked about, gasoline and sugar and coffee. Gasoline was big. So what do you remember? What do you remember about what was difficult to get and what you didn't have, and what was something that was important to
Meat in any canned goods. Sugar. Butter.
I remember most sugar and meat because I was a swimmer. And my dad happened to be a policeman. I came out of Duluth, Minnesota. And of course, we didn't get any meat, And then my dad would come home with this lovely roast. And they said, well, we know you're in training. You need this exercise, but you have to be fed for this exercise to achieve what you're going to achieve. So they would mark it not salvageable. It had to be thrown away, and it was thrown in my dad's car. and I got the head for a couple of nights.
Great. You'll see the sugar one here. There's a great one that talks about sugar, not on fruits, not on desserts, less on cereal, less on coffee. So again, the propaganda went back to the rationing as well. What else? I know we had some other hands on the rationing.
Well, I remember.
I remember clearly the time when gas rationing was started. We were going to high school, my brothers and I, in Washington, D.C. We lived out in Maryland at the time. And so we had about 10 miles to go. We had a 36 Ford, which we drove back and forth to school. And we had to keep it going, but with gas rationing and the stamps and that sort of thing, it was a problem. So we found one gas station who was cheating, who was getting gas at a little extra money. So we went there and bought gas for a time. Then once when we went to get some gas, the guy blew his top and wanted us to get out of there because his associates were in jail now for having done what he refused to do.
Do you remember how many gallons a week you could buy?
No, I don't remember details.
I can address that.
You must have put kerosene in the gas.
How many gallons of gasoline a week?
I remember vividly, I was only 10 or 11 years old, but I remember they had stickers, A, B, and C. Everybody's going, you remember that? If you had an A sticker on your windshield, okay, you were allowed 3 gallons a week. 3. If you had a B sticker, you might be a business owner, and they allowed you maybe 6 gallons or 7 gallons at the most. If you were a commercial truck driver or something, they gave you 10 or 11 gallons a week, and that was it. Now, when you get the book, all the stamps on the page were dated weekly, so it went from Sunday to Saturday. And you could buy, for instance, March 1st to March 8th, you could buy your 3 gallons. You couldn't take the slip, the coupon out of the book, because that was kind of a black market type of thing. You had to go there, buy the gasoline. I don't remember what. I was only 10 years old. I was driving then. Anyway, seriously, there was a stub in there, and you had to use it at that time. If you didn't use it, you lost. Okay? And you couldn't use next week's either. You had to be right in that week, and you had to bring the book with it, and the actual, these were the regulations. Some people bent it a little bit, but you had to, he who pumped the gas had to take the stub right out of your booklet. Remember that. And 3 gallons a week. But don't remember, too, that 80% of people were walking to. We had a situation of industry that you could walk a mile or half a mile or 2 miles to your job. But it was 3 gallons a week, and that was it. If you ran out of gas, well, you left it there and waited till next week and guess what?
Unlimited, as well as politicians. So some things don't change, right?
Well, I was going to make a comment in regard to hoarding. And they used to hoard, different types of commodities. And I remember a cartoon that just stuck with me about hoarding was, there was this little boy who was up talking to his friend who was standing in the doorway of his house. And he says, come on, let's go out and play. And he says, I can't come out and play. He said, I got to stay in and pound sugar. Because when they hoard sugar, it'd settle and, it would be hard. And so you have to go and pound sugar to get those.
I still have my coupon books from when I was young during World War II. Mm-hmm. And I had shoe coupons and wool coat coupons and chocolate coupons, sugar that for some reason we didn't finish using before the war ended. And it's just, I love looking at that book and seeing, what it was like for us then.
Do you recall how many shoes per year per person?
Well, that was a hard thing, and your parents were very careful about your shoes. The minute you got home from school, you took your shoes off, and you put on your old shoes, or even no shoes. And TAPS came into being for city kids. I was growing up in San Francisco, And parents were putting taps on your shoes so they wouldn't wear down so quickly in the heels and the toes. You also passed shoes down a lot more, and a lot of kids wore shoes that really weren't the right size for them, but they needed a pair of shoes. Their feet were growing too fast.
Oh,
Of course, I didn't experience it, but just hearing that, the passing of the shoes, it's, at my age group, we've had so much and haven't had to experience this, but, it's amazing to hear what other people have lived through.
Was equivalent to 6 ration stickers, or tabs. It was one of the things that we were looking through. So it was only for a year. Now your parents may have been holding out on you. They said 3.
I don't know, but my black patent leather shoes had to go. They were much too small for my feet, but I needed them.
And on the sugar comment, do we remember how much sugar you could have per person or per month? Because that was actually controlled.
I don't know, Tom, but I was working in a grocery store in 1942 or 3 before I went to high school, and sugar came in 100-pound bags. And then, so when a bag came in, the manager would say, you and you, let's go out into the back room.
It's a local story. My grandfather had a meat market on Beaver Avenue, which no longer exists. It was paved over to provide an on-ramp for the Ohio River Boulevard, right next to the old Three Rivers Stadium. But when I went off to the Army, I didn't know that the meat market had been sold in my absence. And then when I got out of the Army, I found out that, yes, it had been sold to a party that I knew nothing about. Some 30 years later, I just casually met a salesman in a company that I was calling on, and I casually mentioned that my grandfather had a meat market on Beaver Avenue, and his eyes lit up and he said, "Oh, yes, I know that market. We bought it." And we turned it into a black market. And he was bragging about it, and I was so outraged at that he had taken the family meat market and turned it into a black market during World War II. Thank goodness I never saw him again.
Remember that the coupon books were according to your age, because my brother was 5 years older than me, so he was a teenager. And he had many more coupons than I did. He could get more chocolate, more sugar, more everything. And I remember my coupon books say occupation schoolgirl, height 4'6".
One of the things that we in the country used to do was plant victory gardens. I remember planting a lot of vegetables, and I don't know that they ever went any place.
You're stealing my show.
Oh.
That's okay, we'll stay there. We'll keep on that one. I want you to talk more about that, but the statistics I think is amazing. I shared with Karen. The victory gardens produced 1/3 of the total crop used in World War II. There was 20 million families planting victory gardens in the United States, and we represented 1/3 of the total crop produced in the United States. Wow.
I knew it was important.
and there's a section here too that talks about again the land army. That was all about can all you can and all the things that you could do, and so the Women's Land Army was a big part of the victory gardens as well. So there was a couple of hands on here.
Before I'm in service, I had a paper route. Before I went to service, I had a paper route. And I was having trouble in a rural area. I was having trouble getting tires and fuel. But delivering a paper qualified for additional gas and tires. The paper was very important to everyone.
So couple more, sure.
Silk was gracious and hard to get, as most of it came from the Far East in Japan. So the ladies were out there silk stockings. So they used to go bare-legged and painted a stripe down the back of their legs, because that's how silk stockings were made. And that was very noticeable from us young fellows.
Could you do a straight line?
I'll add to that. There's an interesting, when you talk about the home front in Europe, because of the rationing that went on in the Allied nations and some of the in Germany and Belgium, there was no clothing or no fabrics, and it became very common for women, specifically in Belgium, to use the American parachutes to make clothes for blouses and for little girls' dresses. And there's a lot of history behind women that had camouflage shirts and green and the different colored parachutes. I'm sure some of these guys remember the different colored parachutes meant different supplies were being dropped, correct? I think it was white, red, green, camouflage. So based on what the color of the parachute was, indicated to the troops what was being dropped. So when the planes would drop the cargo, the little children in Europe would go and collect the parachutes, and the women would then make clothes out of parachutes. And we have some great friends in Belgium, and they have a photograph of some grandchildren that are all wearing camouflage schoolgoer dresses. The whole school, all the girls are wearing camouflage dresses. And it's, you think, well, where's that from? And she said it was from the silk parachutes from the Americans. So it's a couple of them.
I can tell you where Rosie the Riveter started at. My nephew's mother was Rosalie, her first name was Rosalie, and she worked in Baltimore making bombers. So that's where Rosie the Riveter started at.
Excellent.
Her first name was Rosalie, and she was a riveter in making bombers in Baltimore. What was the name of the place she worked at? Martin area in Baltimore.
That's amazing.
Where they made the bombers and bomb it.
Sure.
Place overseas. Well, her first name was Rosalie.
That's great.
That's where Rosie the Riveter started at.
That's excellent. Carrying over some more. Very close. I have to go take a nap. Or at least put some tennis shoes on, would you?
You don't have to go to the
Get the sandals off. Put some running shoes on.
You mentioned the parachutes. The white ones were the ones that everybody wanted. And most of them saved wedding dresses.
Oh, sorry.
There were a lot of gals who were married in parachute dresses. Oh, and Tom Burgess mentioned about the stamps. I was a paper boy too. And I remember everybody on my paper route was buying stamps. And we had to account for all those. And it was amazing how many people scraped together 2 bits to buy a stamp every time I collected for the paper every week. And it took, I forget now how many stamps in that little book. It was like the old green stamp things. But the stamps were red.
Sure.
When you got enough of them in there, you got a bond, $18.75 bond.
I had a paper
It was
route.
actually a $25 bond that was redeemed.
Another thing I remember is that housing was very hard and difficult, and my mom actually moved in with another woman and the 2 babies, and lived together. So it was, I think there were a lot of people like that, where the women lived together while the men were off fighting the war.
Getting back to the shoe story, there was no plastic in there for shoes. Everything was made out of leather. Well, you could buy in the stores a little package of little like rubber soles, and and it also had a little metal scratcher that you could roughen up the bottom of your leather soles on your shoes, apply rubber cement that came with the package, and you put these little soles back on the bottom of your shoes like you would used to patch the old winter tubes. They've been a long way.
That lasts about a week, right?
One of the big life items was coffee. And my father was a big coffee drinker. And I remember very well my mother, after coffee, we used the old-fashioned percolator. And after the coffee was perked, she would lay out the coffee grounds on newspaper, put it out in the sun to dry, and then mix some of the used coffee with
a little bit of new coffee to perk the next.
Does anyone have a recollection of pennies turning gray because the copper coating was removed and replaced with zinc? Anyone want to comment on that?
Steel pennies. Steel pennies.
They were made out of zinc.
Correct.
Made out of zinc, not copper.
They took the copper out and replaced it with zinc, right?
They were silver.
Right.
Or gray.
1943.
Right now, it's worth about 3 punches a piece.
So on rationing, anything else that comes to mind? There's a couple in the back.
Found in a farm building out hunting when I was a kid. It's a Illinois license plate. And as I understand the license plate, it's not metal. As I understand it was made of compressed soybeans, a shortage of metal, and so they made these license plates out of these compressed soybeans. I'm also told that the farmers hated them because the animals like to eat them off the wheel. But I still have that plate. I really treasure it, and because of its purpose.
Four 3 times a day, right, guys? 4 cigarettes 3 times a day? Is that was in the K ration?
In the K ration.
In the K ration, 4 cigarettes?
Couple of things. What is mentioned, the fact that butter and any kind of cooking fat was limited. And I can recall my mother using something called Nuco, where you mix some coloring with something that looked like lard and turn it into butter. And that was quite an experience. The other thing was talk about meat shredding.
And they're asking, it was called Nuco. What was the product called?
NUCOA.
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 Marginal.
Right.
It was a substitute for water. Nobody's mentioned a collection of scrap, but one of the efforts, war efforts at home, was a collection of all kinds of metal.
Sure.
Scrap metal became a big commodity. And then the third thing, we talked about retreading shoes. That was where retreading tires began to develop. When we couldn't get new tires, we started, manufacturers started making retreads. And that was how we kept automobiles going.
War effort. So what do you remember about yourself or someone in your family or friend getting involved with in terms of civilian defense corps or the civilian service corps, salvage programs, scrap, the victory gardens? Does anyone have a memory of someone getting involved in a civilian type role? One of the things we talked about, the victory gardens, of everyone doing that. Does anyone have a recollection of? There's a couple there. A little girl.
But anyway, I was a rather privileged little girl in our little village of 2100. And because I had 3 brothers in the service, 2 were in the 1st Marine Division and in the Pacific, and the other was one of the twins, and he was drafted. So we had our banners with our blue stars, and one, of course, after Guadalcanal was gold. And the American Legion thought I needed something to do to keep me busy. And so I was a junior air raid warden. And I went up with a girlfriend who was just a little older than I. We did it during the day, and we spotted planes. Also, when there were blackouts, I got on my little bike and circled the neighborhood to make sure that all the black curtains were drawn. I didn't have any trouble at all because they were really dark, and you did it.
Like Phyllis, I was an airplane spotter. I remember we had flashcards that we had to learn all the different shapes and so forth. And we were driven to like a field and where the visibility was good. And we would, check on the planes that were that we could spot, whether it was visible or whether we heard. It was 1 by high, C X-ray 972. That was our call letters from where I was. And then we were given little wings and so forth like that. So
Grew up in San Francisco in the Marina District, and we were right down between the Presidio of San Francisco and Fort Mason. And every afternoon, one class in our school was brought down by the teacher to the railroad tracks that came in at Fort Mason, and the hospital ships brought the men into Letterman Hospital. And we would all be standing there waving flags and throwing kisses. It was really important to us. And in the morning, we would get a treat. This also was one class a day. The submarine nets across San Francisco Bay went up and down just twice a day. And it was quite an affair. They had tugboats out there with these water arcades and these huge, and people lived out there on these floating barges or rafts that manned these nets. And the nets came up, and all the ships would come in and out, coming and going for about an hour and a half. And it was, quite an exciting place.
Be ready if the enemy were to attack the U.S. So we're going to maybe get into that a little bit more and ask you, what do you remember about what you did to plan and train and prepare at home during the war? And one of the things that I found, which was very interesting, was a letter from the Department of Defense, and it listed 4 signals. Does anyone remember what the 4 signals for the air raid were? The first one was blue, which was probability of an air attack. Second one was red, which was enemy overhead. The third was blue, which was the enemy has passed. And the fourth was white, which was all clear. So does anyone remember either, being a young girl in school, or someone that would remember any training or any of the things that they would go through to get you prepared for air raids, or the block wardens? We talked about that. People would come down the block at night.
I remember that my father volunteered, or other people did, and he had a regular territory going around at night to look for any lights that were exposed from homes. They wanted to do a complete blackout. And so the whole town was laid out that way. And I used to go with them, and if you found a little sliver of light over here, you ring the doorbell and say, hey, fix that curtain or something.
How about did anyone have to learn how to read a map? That went along with the sighting of the airplanes.
We had binoculars, and we were on top of a school building, and that was the highest place in our little village. And there was a little shed up there, and it had a little heater, and it had windows all the way around. And you had information too, you had cards. And then our call was to go into Buffalo, New York, and report anything. I guess maybe that's why I learned to read directions.
I don't know if your husband agrees. Would you like to comment?
Whatever she said was right.
So the other thing at this point, I think, which is important, was you're trying to kind of have topic-based. We were about half an hour. I wanted to open it up to anything that you remember about being at home during the war. And I should probably fill the rest of the time because it's specific to a person. What do you recall? Is it how you learned? Was it going to the radio at night? Was it reading the newspaper? How did you become knowledgeable about what was going on in the war? So let's just open up to a general topic of your most vivid memory of the war effort here at home.
I remember two things that stand out. How many people have heard of the Minutemen?
Only in the Revolution.
Right after Pearl Harbor, there was a kind of a panic about our being invaded and being bombed. So locally, and I was a senior in high school, locally we organized the Minutemen. And that was an odd conglomeration of men who had shotguns, rifles, pistols, and we met one night a week and trained to repel the enemy. That was great. The other thing was that the radio was the great means of keeping abreast. And I can still recall listening to William L. Schara from Berlin and Edward R. Murrah from London reporting on world events. I mean, they weren't just reporting what was going on in England or in Germany. They were reporting on world events. And that was a nightly experience at our house, was to listen to those people on, I guess it was CBS, I'm not sure the network at that time.
What time at night would they come on? Was it a report every? What time at night would the reports come on?
It was about 7 o'clock, as I recall. So that was about that time.
Jim, what town was your
After the dinner.
What town was your Minutemen in?
What town was the Minutemen in? What town did you grow up in?
Were they in?
Yes, sir.
Schara was in Berlin.
No, the Minutemen. The Minutemen.
Your Minutemen experience.
What town was that in?
Oh, my town? Yeah. Oh, it was a little burg about 20 miles from Washington, Prince Frederick. Nobody ever heard of it. Prince Frederick, Maryland.
Bob's trying to figure out if you can do
One of the
that.
other things I remember, of course, was the preparedness. The Navy established an amphibious training base near Solomons. And in 1942, there was almost a continuous convoy of Army conveyances through the little town. It was the only road through town. The only road south was through the little town. And here all these soldiers were out guarding all the intersections and sending these fellows down to their Solomons, where they trained for amphibious landings. So, I remember all
Very
this.
short. My mother was 14 in 1941. And in Arizona, her school classes were taken out of school, and they went out in the fields and picked cotton for the war effort. And she suffered from asthma, and she told how for weeks, she'd be suffering with asthma, but she was out there picking cotton in the fields in Arizona.
From that time was Lowell Thomas. And when he came on the radio, he would say, "Oh, but there's good news tonight." And then he would give, of course, all of that.
There's a percent that would be punched and coded and marked out. So do any of the soldiers remember getting Swiss she-mail that were read, previously opened? That's what they classified it as. So the mail that was sent from home would be opened and read, and the mail coming back would be opened and read. And one of the comments that they said, it was very common that half the letter was blacked out and marked out. You couldn't put anything on it. So they called that the Swiss mail for all the holes that were in the letters. Does anyone remember getting those types of letters? And
I remember the black marks from my father, but of course we never saw the black marks that my mother might have sent. So I just remember, because my father was gone for over 3 years, it was really hard to find something to write to him. And my mother wrote to him every day, but after I could say that I was a junior commando or I wrapped bandages today, I just never knew what to say.
So there was a lot of excitement around the mail, so I think we're going to keep you busy. Anything else on mail, or it's the right side's turn? Someone's pointing. The V email, right? It was
Yes,
V
it was
mail.
email. I sent some of that home.
Yeah.
And they didn't block it out, they cut it out.
Right. Punched it.
My mother saved every letter that I wrote home. I had to.
Do you remember how long it took to get? Did she ever tell you how long from when the date was signed to when she?
No, she never discussed anything like that. But I do have all the letters, and thank you for that.
That's good. You still have them?
I still have them, yes.
That's great. Share them. Make sure you share them.
Oh yes, I want to pass them on to my son.
Absolutely. Back. So you were a little boy.
No,
a little boy.
I was before a little boy. I wasn't even a glimmer. In the war, my mother hadn't even met my father yet. But my mother, having grown up in Brooklyn, used to go into the city and dance with all of the GIs that were getting shipped out. And so she had all sorts of email back from all the guys that went overseas, men I've never heard of or met for the most part, because she didn't meet my father till he came home. But she had a lot of that mail when I was growing up, and I did get to see it, and of course, I asked all the questions about it. Unfortunately, now I think it's pretty much lost, although my mother saves just about everything. She may still have some.
Does anyone remember?
Still have them.
Oh, excellent.
My mother didn't have them all. And my brother, who was in Korea, she kept all of his mail too.
That's excellent.
I was a newspaper boy. I sent this story to a few people, but I want to address it to all of you. I was a newspaper boy, 11 years old, and every day during World War II, there was a 5-inch square map on the front page, and everybody could follow the line, especially in Europe. You could follow a line daily. Of course, daily, it didn't really move that much until the Battle of the Bulge. And I had this woman, maybe 50, 60 years old at the time. I thought she was old. anyway, she would always meet me when I was walking up the sidewalk to the front house. She would meet me right at the door, and she'd look at it, rain, snow, anything. She'd be looking at it and looking at that map. And the next day, all the time. And the next day, and this went on for months, 2, 3, 4 months, so to speak. But I can't remember that much. But then all of a sudden, one day, she wasn't there. And the next day, she wasn't there. And the next day, she wasn't there. And 2 weeks went by, and then I recalled what happened. The body came back, and they would come down the main street. And every 2 weeks or so, there was somebody coming back in a sealed box. But her son was killed in the Battle of the Bulge. That's what I remember.
I wrote a letter home when I first got over there as a replacement. Of course, you couldn't tell what outfit you were with. But my sister, who was at State College, there were a lot of oak trees around the college, and she was the editor of the newspaper. The name of the newspaper was the Acorn. And I wrote home in the letter about Ann's topic about her newspaper seems pretty predominant, and they couldn't figure it out. So she said to the folks, I think he's trying to tell us he's in Aachen, Germany.
Shaver's skirt be black. There's ink that they could put on it, would go through the paper, and that's how the government basically blacked out anything they thought was this. We'll leave this up here too. We'll go through this. This is a book about Homefront. So it's an interesting book if anyone wants to look at that and walk and go through. That kind of lays out the same it's V for victory, and you can look at it as well. So what else comes to mind? What other vivid memories of being at home? There you go. See, this is the way it works. If you raise your hand and point to your neighbor.
My husband was in the Star Valley at the time our son was born in the States. And he was real good at writing a letter. I got a lot of mail from him. But I hadn't received anything after the baby was born.
And I waited and waited. It got to be 3 weeks before I finally heard from him. And I found out that he had gotten leave and he had been in Paris celebrating. He didn't even know he had a child.
When I graduated from high school, I went to work at a defense plant, Union Switching Signal Company. And they were basically engaged in building railway signaling and switching equipment. But they had converted to making carbine, 45 pistols, and A6 machine guns. And I have never yet seen one of those guns that said Union Switching Signal Company on it. I don't know where they all went. And I always wondered if anybody else had ever seen one.
Well, I know for a fact, being from Pittsburgh, that there's a large, I don't know if there's a corporate office, but there's a large corporate building here that's a Union Switching Signal. So that's something I'm going to track down.
Union Switching Signal Company is no longer in business.
But they were bought out, but they had a large presence in Pittsburgh.
Well, Westinghouse Airport.
Yeah, they had a large building, a large presence here, so something we'll have to look into
We
to see.
used to call it the Union Swipe and Swindle.
One of my life-saving decisions came at Golden Acorn, Alabama, and it had to do with the Army Specialized Training Program. They gave a test after 16 weeks of basic training to all the trainees who qualified by dint of the Army General Classification Test. If you had a high score, you could take this test for the Army Specialized Training Program. Some people here were in that program. But the day they gave the test in Alabama, at Fort McClellan, the temperature was in the mid-90s outdoors. We were indoors in a Quonset hut. It was kind of warm in there. And they gave the test. You could hardly think. It was so sweaty. So I figured, what the hell? If I didn't understand the question, or if I couldn't answer the question, I might as well take a shot and put a check mark somewhere. It was a good strategy. I passed the test, and instead of going in on D-Day, I went to the University of Mississippi in the Army Specialized Training Program, and delayed going overseas by, I don't know, it was 5 or 6 months. I went over to the 87th Infantry Division, and I've always had a very, very high opinion. And I think of the guys who actually, I became a journalist after the war, and I think that of the guys who actually fired a shot in World War II, I believe I've written the most about World War II.
I haven't heard anything about sabotage during World War II. But on Christmas Eve, and I believe it was, let's see, maybe 45, we had a warehouse, and it was up near the spotting, the plane spotter area. And it was filled with, it was stored with bomb sites that were made for your B-27s, 17, forgive me. And the whole town was up there watching this burn. My uncle was a mayor at the time at the little village. And prior to 41, we had moved into our town 2 families that had escaped from Holland. And they made quite a splash in this little village. First time I'd ever seen anybody with fur shoe boots. And the daughter and son went into school and graduated within that time. They made Cuba cheese. Does anybody know about Cuba cheese? Oh, I'm sorry. I thought everybody knew about Cuba cheese. The Van Swanenbergs.
Superman.
Peggy?
I know about Superman.
Oh. The Van Swanenbergs started this cheese factory, and it's really quite renowned. It's been sold since then, and the Van Swanenbergs are no longer there. But they were under suspicion at Christmas Eve when there was the sabotaged fire. And they had been there long enough that we respected the families, and we knew about them. And my uncle was devastated that he had to work with them because the government came in and said, you have to get some questions and answers from them. And it was a difficult time. I remember being asked to leave the room because it was private information, but they were proven innocent.
Sure. Do you remember, here's another poster, but it says telling a friend, maybe telling the enemy. Does anyone ever recall a situation where you became uncomfortable just talking about certain things?
Loose lips, sink ships.
No? Any other vivid memories, or maybe some of the generation that would have been told stories from their parents or family members about a vivid memory from the war?
I don't know, we're still on the subject with the email. Are we?
We can talk about anything you want.
Okay. The reason why I asked the question is that I was in combat, and I got an email call. It's any of the fellows get letters on a mail call? Somebody bring it up to you? Well, somebody brought me a letter, and I took it into the foxhole. And I wanted to really read it from my wife, We didn't get too many letters. And, the foxhole was camouflaged. There was a machine gun nest. And I put a blanket over it. And I decided to light a match. And I lit a match, and I opened up the email. And at the moment by my finger, I lit another match. I didn't know that the blanket had a little hole in it. And at that time, Bedtime Charlie. Who ever heard of Bedtime Charlie? There you go, huh? Bedtime Charlie came around and paid me a visit. He saw the light. With the machine gun, with the machine guns of his plane. He didn't hit me, and he left. I looked at the letter, and you know what she wrote? 5 words. She said, she'd like to know about our future. Thank you.
He says and.
What was the future?
Well, this is the future. Whatever's left of us.
And Mr. Pruitt may support the fact that it worked out for her, right?
We went through everything.
It's perfect.
After we came back, we had another war. We wanted to survive. To get back into the action.
That's it. That's it.
The military had a shortage also. In the kitchen, cooks.
Right.
Who couldn't get lard. Oh, sorry. The military had a shortage also.
In the kitchen, the cooks had to take an all-this tallow out of beef and render it down for using for the cooking. So there's nothing left there, nothing wasted. Without no lard, and if you try to bake something, you run into some problems. You had to make a lot of adjustments. So the military, they had shortages also.
I'm another one of those folks who wasn't around. I'm glad my dad came back. But I remember my mom talking about some things, and this is a little bit out of just dealing with the 87th Infantry, but it does have to do with the home front. We're from Eastern North Carolina, and during the war, some of you guys may or may not have heard, there was a huge sprawling Army base called Camp Davis in Eastern North Carolina. It was built down on the pine trees. You go by there now on Highway 17, you would have no clue there was anything there, but it was humongous. And that camp was built by the men who were in all the neighborhoods around were farmers, and just basically barely scraping by before the war began. And I remember my mother telling me, and I didn't know this just recently, that her father, my granddad, and a lot of his brothers came down from around Newbern and Trenton so they could get work to build all the barracks, those wooden barracks that were thrown up quickly to house all the soldiers that came through there. And that base trained a lot of people in coast artillery, field artillery, barrage balloons. And then they eventually had an OCS that opened there. And my father actually went through there twice. Once as enlisted, he had been in the Army in 33, but got out and came back in. He went through all the barrage balloon training there, sent him out to Tennessee, where my sister was born in 43. So they were here most of the time during the early part of the war in America. But then his CO, he was a tech sergeant, and his CO kept on him all the time. You need to go to OCS. I don't want to be an officer. I don't want to be an officer. And he was on him so much that he finally agreed, and they sent him back to Camp Davis. So I left my mother out in Tennessee. She hated that. I mean, she just couldn't stand to be away from him. And so this was part of the experience that they had. He finished up OCS, went back to Tennessee, and was there when they began to beef up the 87th to send him overseas. Because if you guys were there in the beginning, they took thousands of guys out of the unit, and the readiness was way down. So before they could ship you, they had to bring it back up to strength. And a lot of people got brought in from other units. So my dad was reassigned into infantry training and ended up in the 87th. That was one story. The other thing is, when I was in the Navy station in Newport, Rhode Island, I went through OCS, and we had wooden barracks built in World War II. When I moved back up there and was stationed, we rented a house from a little contractor there, a little Portuguese contractor, and we got to talk to him, and he again was one of those people who was struggling before the beginning of the war, and they built this huge Navy base, and he helped build all those barracks that we were trained in up there. So the war brought a lot of opportunity for guys who couldn't go and were here to not only learn a lot of skill or use their skills and create something of value that helped the war effort.
Higgins, and stories I've heard is like you talked about blackouts, and apparently New York City didn't want to do the blackouts because of tourism, and it would affect that. Now, was anybody here that lived in New York City? Apparently, the Crouch ship or submarines would come up and sink our American supply ships. Was anybody here living in there at that time that?
What year?
About New York City.
What year?
Oh, I couldn't tell you what year. I don't recall.
You're talking about the 40s?
40. Sure. Yeah.
Well, I lived in New York City, except in 1943 I went into the 87th Division. What would you like to know about?
Well, the people who were in New York City at the time, when they were seeing the American ships getting sunk, I mean, were they pissed off that they weren't doing the blackouts, or did they care? Or anything
Well, I
like
think
that?
the big question is, can we substantiate the fact that they didn't do the blackout?
All along the Atlantic coast,
All along the coast.
the graveyard of the Atlantic.
I remember the blackouts in New York City in the 60s. Yes, I remember getting lost in New York City in the blackout, coming home from a job. My God, I've never seen anything like it. People all over the place got lost. If we ever had a war, well, 9/11, let's remember 9/11. Huh? That was terrible. I was a cab driver in the city of New York. I went over to those buildings almost every day. My God, picked up passengers, brought them uptown, downtown, back there. At 8 o'clock in the morning, blackout. 8 o'clock in the morning, couldn't walk through the streets over there, Broadway. It was packed with people going to work between 8 and 9. When those planes came down and hit those buildings. If everyone go up to the World Trade Center, visit the World Trade Center, anybody here?
I was there.
It was fabulous. It was blocks and blocks of walking. Look what they did to us. They killed 5,000 people. 5,000 people in a couple of minutes. I think that was the worst blackout that we ever seen in our lives.
For me, I remember that in the Marina District, the solidarity of the women, there were just no husbands at home. None of us had our fathers at home. And most of the men went to the South Pacific from that area. But I do remember in 1946, almost every family had a new baby born. And they were all boys.
There are a couple of hands going up.
All boys. And I remember our teachers saying this was nature's way of replenishing the males that we needed in our world because nobody had a baby sister. It was all boys.
Sure. Now, so hold on, I'll ask you a question. Now, as I recall, San Francisco had a very large population of Japanese people.
They were not there, though, when I was...
Does anyone remember...
Yeah, I remember when they came
of
back.
foreigners in the United States, be it Germans or Japanese or whatever, there, during the war, in your town or in your neighborhood, if someone that would have been of a descent?
No, nobody talked about it because they were gone by then. But when I was about 10 years old, they came back to our schools, and I was shocked because I didn't remember Japanese people. And of course, we had grown up on comic books where the Japanese had these foot-long fingernails, they were always like this, and they were terrifying people. And suddenly we had all these wonderful boys and girls who honestly seemed more American than we did. They were terrific ball players and smart kids, and it's funny, they were accepted right back into our community, and we never had any problems.
That's great.
And they seemed more American than we did sometimes.
During the war. And from about June until 1st of September, we started school. And the park, or the government, I should say, would send buses into the park. I worked in Fishing Bridge. And the Japanese people would be there for a day, early in the morning till late at night. The older mothers and fathers spoke Japanese, and were not very polite, and I can't say I blame them in some respects because they were taken away from everything they owned. The young ones, of course, spoke English beautifully, and we always think of Japanese being short. In that time, I was 5'8", and all these tall Japanese boys, 6 foot, 5'10", 5'11", and really had a great, great time. And so the one time we got a call, move them out in a hurry. So we did, and along these 2 buses, and sorry fellows, it was returning veterans from the Pacific. They were coming into the park to spend 3 days with us. And here were the Japanese going out that way, and our boys coming in another way. Well, I still get choked up because it was quite a thing to see all these boys. I was 16. No legs, no arms, sometimes both of them blind. It just broke our hearts. And we had it all summer long like that. So I don't remember, and I never wrote down where they came from. I mean, what hospital they brought or whatever. But that was a great experience. I also have another one, being from northern Minnesota. All the farm boys, well, and guys that worked in the forest, which we have up there, were in the Army. So what did we have? Well, my dad came home on the weekends. He was on the Delaware fisherman, and he said to my mother, when you go take the girls to the show, don't go out for lunch, for dinner. And she said, why? He said, I'm just telling you, don't go to Miller's cafeteria. Don't go. My mother, didn't pay attention to my father. So off we went to Miller's cafeteria.
That's a trend, I think, right? It's just rumor has it.
Yeah, right. And we were sitting there, and all of a sudden, we were told to please get up and move. They moved us back into a room, and as we're going back, I was very curious and looked, and it happened to be German soldiers. Now, they came and they worked in our force and cut the trees, and they were there to the end of the war. And so then my mother Dad came home, she said, what happened? He said, I told you not to go there. They had quite a few men that worked. And later in life, when our kids were in school, I met a gentleman that worked with my husband in the committee, and he said, you know what? And he said, what? He said, I'm back here. And John said, no, why? He said, because I was one of those German prisoners that worked in your force, and we got to know the Americans. And he said, you'd be surprised how many of us are back here. And so it's really kind of interesting, because they got a good outlook of what we really, truly were, not what they thought.
Question. What is the story behind that booklet that you have with all those old ads in it? I mean, that took a lot of effort to put together.
Well, there's two things. One is that when Karen, and I don't really want to talk because that's not why I'm here, I want to facilitate, but when Karen and I talked about it, we realized, or at least I realized in the conversation of the home front, most of the efforts that were tied to the home front were done through propaganda. And the posters that were made, I mean, there's probably hundreds more that aren't there, and some of the ones that the British had their own, and so it just became a function of just seeing all of the posters that were there and how they tied specifically to a very, very dire need or whatever. But the creativity that the government used to create these slogans around, like you said, Rosie the Riveter or Loose Lips Sink Ships. I mean, it was an all-in men, women, and children effort, and they tied these things. So as I was going through and researching this, the posters just became kind of a fun thing to see and tie back to the home front. And they really were everywhere on every topic, and at any time, any reason, it was just reason to support what was going on overseas.
But I meant, that's 60 years ago. Where did you get them? I can't forget the...
Oh, that's a secret. That's classified. We'll get closer.
I just remember that Lucky Strike Green went to war. Did anybody know about that? And it just seemed to me that everybody in those days were smokers.
I stumbled across this the other day. I thought I'd share it with you on the internet. It's called World War II in Photos, and it's published by the Atlantic online, the Atlantic magazine. And I'll give it. I think we'll be able to link to it from our site. It's World War II in Photos, and it's in 20 parts. The one that I first saw, somebody sent to me, actually it was posted on their Facebook page, and I looked at it. Each of these segments has 45 photographs, original photographs. There's 20 segments. So there'll be over 900 photographs in total once it's completed. But right now there are only nine of them that's been completed. Number 8 was the first one that I saw. And number 8 was titled The American Home Front in Color. And when I looked at those pictures, I was astounded because, let me see if I can open this up. The quality of the photography, I don't know if you can see this.
We'll put it on the counter when we're done, if you want
The
to.
quality of the photography, the color photography from 1941 and 42 was unbelievable.
What's the website again?
It's the Atlantic.
We'll
I'll
put it
leave
on
it up
the-
here so you
We'll
can
link
see
it on the
it.
association.
But that's just one of the segments, titled The Home Front. But there's going to be a total of 20. The next segment, number 10, will be active on the 21st. Tomorrow, right?
More posters, you can get to them all free.
I mean, a lot of the ones you can buy, the reproductions you can buy, and there's a lot of.
There's a lot of sites that sell them.
Sure.
There's some educational institutions that have just made them available for free. We'll try to get those links.
Put that on there too.
Put on the research.
I mean, some of the ones from Britain are phenomenal. I mean, it's
There's even propaganda posters on this Northwestern site that are in German.
sure they were here.
German.
Right, that's amazing.
If you have a 10-year-old, he or she can probably help.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
that's my secret. So, did you want to? You said you had an offering. You wanted Okay. So, anybody else? Oh, right here.
I remember when I came home, my mother and father met me at the railroad station. So my dad said, "He'll take my bag," so I handed it to him in a board. He was smaller than I was, and he just went down with a heavy bag.
That's great. Vivid memory. Never forget it. All right, there you go. One more.
I'll make it fast here, but after the war, when I was serving in Germany as an MP, I met a family, and we became friends. And several years later, maybe 20 years later, I don't know, Phil knows, we went back to Germany and visited this family, all three generations. And our host was having his birthday party, and he was 50 or 40 or something. So they had a lot of German friends in. And the story we heard about the Germans working in the woods up here reminds us of that. Because we had a submarine commander, we had a pilot, and we had another gentleman, all in World War II. And we just became friends almost as if there'd never been a war. Not more like what this lady said over here, the PWs came back here to live. So attitudes really change and get better. Yeah.
As they say, going once, going twice. Hey, we're on time, so if you didn't like the presentation, please give me credit for being on time. Put the books in the binders and the other books, so please take your time looking for those.
Great job, John. Pulling the arms out of the little kid. Just gave it one arm. And he said, all of my guys, when we got over to Germany, and we were particularly in Belgium, we kept looking for all these one-armed Belgian boys. And never did see one arm. Okay, we'll see you at 4 o'clock.